The real story is what Qatar just told every government in the Middle East, every military planner in Washington, and every strategic analyst in Beijing simultaneously, with a single decision about who actually holds power in the Persian Gulf in 2026. And the answer to that question is not the one you have been hearing from Western media. I am looking at a pattern of diplomatic signals, financial movements, and military repositioning that has been building for 18 months, confirmed across reporting by Al Jazeera, Reuters, the Financial Times, and multiple regional security analysts whose assessments have been circulating in policy circles since early 2025. What these signals show is not a host nation expressing minor irritation. They are not the product of a scheduling dispute or a lease renegotiation gone wrong. What they show is a small but extraordinarily wealthy Gulf state making a calculated, deliberate, and irreversible statement about the future architecture of Middle Eastern security. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why Qatar made this decision now, why the timing is inseparable from the broader Iran negotiations currently underway, and why what appears to be a bilateral disagreement between Doha and Washington is actually the first visible crack in an American military posture that has defined this region for 30 years. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is not being framed this way anywhere in the Western press, and that absence is itself a data point worth examining. Al Udeid is not simply a large airbase. It is, by any serious military assessment, the most strategically significant American military installation in the entire Central Command theater. It houses the forward headquarters of United States Central Command. It is hosted at various points over 10,000 American military personnel. It is the hub through which American air operations across Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and the broader Persian Gulf region have been coordinated for the better part of 3 decades. The runway infrastructure at Al Udeid is among the longest in the Middle East. The logistics network built around it represents decades of American investment, both financial and diplomatic. Qatar is a peninsula roughly the size of Connecticut, jutting into the Persian Gulf with a population of approximately 3 million people, the vast majority of whom are expatriate workers. It holds the third largest proven natural gas reserves on the planet. Its sovereign wealth fund, the Qatar Investment Authority, manages assets exceeding $500 billion. It is simultaneously home to the largest American military base in the region and the headquarters of Al Jazeera, the Arabic language media network that has spent 2 decades being a source of deep irritation to American allies across the Gulf. That contradiction, the American military anchor coexisting with the regional media voice most hostile to American-aligned governments, has always told you something important about how Qatar operates. Doha has never been a client state. It has always been a sovereign actor using its extraordinary financial leverage to maintain strategic autonomy in a neighborhood where strategic autonomy is rarely permitted. What changed between 2024 and now is the regional environment in which that autonomy is being exercised. The Iran nuclear negotiations, the shifting alignment of Gulf states toward Beijing's Belt and Road framework, the slow-motion collapse of American credibility following the Gaza conflict, and the emerging multipolar security architecture being constructed in parallel to American dominance, all of these forces converged on a single moment. And Qatar, with characteristic precision, chose that moment to act. According to reporting by the Financial Times and confirmed by 3 regional diplomatic sources cited by Reuters in March 2026, the decision to formally notify the United States of a revised basing arrangement was not spontaneous. It was the result of a policy review that began inside the Qatari Foreign Ministry in mid-2024, accelerated through late 2025, and culminated in a formal communication delivered to the American ambassador in Doha in February of this year. Announcement number 1. Qatar did not close the base because of a disagreement with Washington. Qatar restructured the basing arrangement because Doha had concluded that the strategic value of unconditional American military presence had turned negative. This distinction matters enormously, and it is being almost entirely missed in Western coverage. The framing of closure suggests an emotional reaction of falling out, a diplomatic tantrum, a host nation throwing Americans out in frustration. That framing is wrong, and it is wrong in a way that is deliberately comforting to American policymakers, because it implies the situation is reversible through better diplomacy or a change in tone. What Qatar actually communicated, according to diplomatic sources cited by Middle East Eye and corroborated by analysis published by the International Crisis Group, in April 2026, is a transition from an open-ended hosting arrangement to a conditional, time-limited, purpose-specific framework. The American military does not lose access to Al Udeid immediately or completely. What it loses is unconditional presence, the assumption that the base is simply available for whatever Washington decides to do in the region, without consultation, without limitation, and without consequence for Qatar. Think carefully about what this represents. Qatar is not expelling America. Qatar is reclassifying America from unconditional strategic partner to conditional operational tenant. And that reclassification carries implications that extend far beyond the specific terms of any revised basing agreement. The reason this calculation shifted is documented and traceable. The Gaza conflict, which generated unprecedented popular pressure across the Arab world beginning in late 2023 and continuing through 2025, placed every Gulf government in an impossible position. Hosting American military infrastructure while American aircraft, fueled and supported through that infrastructure, were being used in operations that Arab populations viewed as catastrophic. This created a domestic political liability that Gulf governments could no longer manage through silence. Qatar's calculation, according to analysis by the Carnegie Middle East Center published in early 2026, was that the cost of unconditional American basing had shifted from an acceptable strategic expense to an unacceptable sovereign liability. The base was making Qatar less secure in the eyes of its own population and its regional neighbors, not more secure. Announcement number 2. The timing of this decision is inseparable from the Iran nuclear framework currently being negotiated, and Washington's own negotiating position has been fundamentally weakened as a result. This is the part that American strategic analysts are discussing privately, but that almost no major Western outlet is connecting in print. Al Udeid has historically served as one of the primary instruments of American coercive leverage in the Gulf. The implicit and sometimes explicit message to regional governments, including Iran, has been that American military power is immediately and massively deployable from Qatari soil. That deployability has been a component of American deterrence and American negotiating power in every major regional interaction for 30 years. When Qatar restructures that arrangement, it does not eliminate American capability. American forces retain significant presence and significant capabilities throughout the region, but it introduces a layer of conditionality into American deployability that did not previously exist. And in strategic negotiations, the difference between unconditional deployability and conditional deployability is not a minor technical distinction. It is a fundamental shift in the credibility of a threat. Reporting by Bloomberg and confirmed by a former senior State Department official speaking on Background to Politico in March 2026 indicates that Iranian negotiators are aware of the Qatari decision and have incorporated it into their assessment of American leverage. The Iranian calculation, according to these sources, is that American military options in the Gulf have become incrementally more constrained at precisely the moment when Washington is attempting to negotiate from a position of maximum pressure. Stay with me, because this is where the strategic picture becomes even more complex and where the mainstream framing completely breaks down. The United States has responded to the Qatari decision through a combination of private pressure and public minimization. Publicly, the Pentagon and the State Department have emphasized continuity statements to the effect that the American military relationship with Qatar remains strong, that Al Udeid continues to operate, that the partnership is valued. These statements are technically accurate and strategically misleading simultaneously. Yes, the base continues to operate, but the legal and political framework under which it operates has changed, and that change has implications that no amount of reassuring press releases can undo. According to defense analyst Dr. Bilal Saab, formerly of the Middle East Institute, writing in Foreign Affairs in February 2026, the Qatari decision reflects a broader pattern of Gulf states seeking what he terms strategic hedge portfolios relationships with multiple great powers that preserve maximum autonomy rather than relationships with a single dominant patron that require political loyalty in exchange for security guarantees. Announcement number 3. Qatar is not moving toward China or Iran. Qatar is moving toward sovereignty. And that destination is more threatening to American strategic interests than any adversarial alignment would be. If Qatar was simply switching from an American patron to a Chinese patron, Washington's strategic playbook would be clear: economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, alliance management to contain the damage. American policymakers understand patron switching. They have dealt with it before. What they are far less equipped to handle is a wealthy, sophisticated Gulf state that has decided it does not need a patron at all, that it can use its financial resources, its geographic position, its gas reserves, and its diplomatic networks to navigate great power competition without committing to any side. Because a Qatar that belongs to no one cannot be pressured through the mechanisms that work on states embedded in American alliance structures. It cannot be threatened with loss of security guarantees it has already chosen to diversify away from. It cannot be isolated from an international community it has been cultivating relationships with for decades. Qatar currently maintains active diplomatic relationships with Hamas, the Taliban, Iran, Israel, the United States, China, Turkey, and Russia simultaneously. This is not hypocrisy. This is a deliberate and sophisticated foreign policy strategy. Doha has positioned itself as the indispensable interlocutor in every major regional conflict precisely because it refuses to be captured by any single great power framework. Now let us talk about what is actually happening behind the headlines, because there are two entirely different stories playing out simultaneously, and Western media is only covering one of them. The story Western media is covering is the bilateral story Washington and Doha, disagreement and negotiation. Will the Americans stay or go? What does this mean for American deterrence in the Gulf? This story is real. It is also incomplete to the point of being misleading. The story Western media is not covering is the regional story what Qatar's decision signals to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE, to Kuwait, to Bahrain, to every other Gulf state watching Doha navigate this transition and calculating whether the same path is available to them. Saudi Arabia has spent the past 3 years in active diplomatic engagement with China, including a landmark security cooperation agreement signed in 2023 that American officials described at the time as deeply concerning. The UAE normalized relations with Israel under the Abraham Accords, but simultaneously expanded economic and military cooperation with China to a degree that has generated repeated friction with Washington. Bahrain, which hosts the United States Fifth Fleet, has conducted its own quiet assessment of the long-term sustainability of that hosting arrangement, according to regional sources cited by the Financial Times. The pattern is consistent and unmistakable. Gulf states are not abandoning America. They are systematically reducing their dependence on America as their sole security guarantor. Qatar's base restructuring is the most dramatic and visible manifestation of a trend that has been building across the entire Gulf Cooperation Council for the better part of a decade. Trump responded to the Qatari decision by describing it in private meetings as a betrayal and by directing the State Department to communicate American displeasure through multiple diplomatic channels. This has not notably changed Qatar's position. Think carefully about what this moment represents. When a country that hosts your largest regional military base, a country you have provided with security guarantees, a country your government has protected diplomatically for decades, when that country decides to reclassify your military presence from unconditional to conditional, and your response is anger and private diplomatic pressure, and that response changes nothing, you have received a verdict. Not a negotiating position, not an opening bid, a verdict about the relative weight of American leverage in 2026 versus what it was in 2006 or 1996. And if you are watching this and you wonder why any of this matters beyond the abstract realm of geopolitical analysis, consider the following. The American military presence in the Gulf has been one of the primary mechanisms through which Washington has managed global energy markets, maintained the dollar's role as the dominant currency of global oil trade, and projected the kind of credible military threat that has shaped the behavior of governments from Tehran to Beijing to Moscow. Every degree to which that presence becomes conditional rather than absolute, negotiated rather than assumed, is a degree to which American economic and strategic leverage in the most energy-significant region on the planet is reduced. And that reduction eventually reaches your energy bills, your freight costs, and the purchasing power of every dollar you earn. Consider the experience of the British Empire in the decades following the Second World War. Britain emerged from that war technically on the winning side, with its global alliance network nominally intact, its military bases spanning the globe from Hong Kong to Aden to Cyprus. But the financial exhaustion of the war, combined with the rising nationalism of previously compliant client states, meant that Britain's basing network, which had appeared to be a source of strength, became increasingly a source of liability. Host nations that had previously accepted British military presence as an unambiguous benefit began to calculate the political cost of that presence against its strategic value. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was the moment when this calculation became undeniable. When Britain, France, and Israel launched military operations in Egypt, it was not Egyptian military power that ended the campaign. It was American financial pressure and the political unwillingness of regional partners to continue absorbing the diplomatic cost of British military adventures conducted from their soil and with their tacit support. The parallel to the current American position in the Gulf is not exact, but it is instructive. The United States is not Britain in 1956. American power remains vastly greater than British power was at that moment. But the dynamic, a dominant military power whose regional basing network is shifting from an asset to a negotiated arrangement because host nations have recalculated the cost-benefit equation, is recognizable. The end of the British basing network in the Gulf, which concluded formally with the British withdrawal east of Suez, announced in 1968, did not happen suddenly. It happened gradually, then all at once, as host nation after host nation revised the terms of an arrangement that had previously been assumed. So where does this leave us? There is no honest way to offer a single clean prediction here, because what Qatar has set in motion involves decisions by too many independent actors with too many independent calculations. But let me give you three clear paths, because understanding the range of plausible outcomes is more useful than false certainty. Path 1, negotiated stabilization. In this scenario, Washington and Doha reach a revised basing agreement that preserves meaningful American military presence at Al Udeid under a new framework that gives Qatar greater formal control over operational parameters. The Americans accept the reclassification, manage the symbolic damage through careful public messaging, and the immediate practical impact on American military capability in the region is contained. This is the scenario that American and Qatari diplomats are publicly working toward. It requires Washington to accept a significant reduction in the unconditional nature of its Gulf basing posture, and to do so without triggering a cascade of similar renegotiations across the region. Given the precedent Qatar has now established, that second requirement may already be impossible to meet regardless of what the Doha Agreement ultimately says. Path 2, accelerating regional restructuring. In this scenario, the Qatari decision functions as the signal that other Gulf states were waiting for confirmation that restructuring American basing arrangements is survivable diplomatically and financially, that Washington's response will be anger and pressure, but ultimately accommodation, and that the strategic environment now permits a level of sovereign assertiveness that was not previously available. Saudi Arabia moves forward with expanded Chinese security cooperation. The UAE formalizes arrangements that have been informal. Bahrain begins its own review. The cumulative effect is not the expulsion of America from the Gulf, but the transformation of American military presence from a network of unconditional bases to a collection of negotiated, conditional, purpose-specific arrangements, each individually manageable, collectively transformative. I think we are closer to this path than the current diplomatic framing suggests. Path 3, regional escalation driven by miscalculation. This is the scenario that keeps serious analysts awake. In an environment where American deterrence credibility is being actively questioned, where Iran's negotiating posture has shifted based on its assessment of American constraints, and where multiple actors are simultaneously revising their calculations about what America will and will not do, the risk of miscalculation rises. Not because any single actor wants escalation, but because deterrence works through shared assumptions about red lines and costs. When those shared assumptions are being renegotiated, the space for miscalculation expands. A Qatari decision made in pursuit of rational sovereign autonomy, an Iranian negotiating position calibrated on revised leverage assessments, an American response shaped by domestic political pressure, these rational individual calculations can combine into an outcome that no single actor chose or wanted. Here are the questions I want you to carry forward from this analysis. Is the American security architecture in the Gulf capable of adapting to conditional basing relationships without losing the deterrence value those relationships were designed to create? Is Qatar's calculation that sovereign autonomy is more valuable than unconditional American protection going to prove correct? Or will the absence of that protection create vulnerabilities that Doha's financial power cannot compensate for? And most importantly, if the Gulf states are genuinely moving toward a post-American security architecture, What fills the space that American military presence currently occupies? And what does that transition look like for everyone living in the region and everyone dependent on the energy that flows out of it? Tell me in the comments what you think Washington does next. Does the administration accept the revised terms and manage the precedent damage? Or does it push back hard enough to turn a manageable restructuring into a genuine rupture? Tell me also whether you think the other Gulf states move quickly or slowly. The timeline on Path 2 depends almost entirely on whether Saudi Arabia reads the Qatari outcome as permission or as a warning. We will keep tracking every development in Doha, in Riyadh, in Tehran, and in Washington as this situation develops. That is what this analysis does every single day. Subscribe now, share this with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what is actually happening in the Gulf. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next one.